Hello, everyone. My name is Colonel Kevin Chung, and together with Lieutenant Colonel Jason Blaylock, Chief of Medicine at Walter Reed, I'd like to welcome you to the joint USU-Walter Reed Medicine Grand Rounds. We have a great one lined up for you today. At this time, I want to turn it over to Lieutenant Colonel Blaylock.
All right, good afternoon, Walter Reed and USU teams. Really appreciate everyone joining us today for what I think is going to be a great engagement. Over the past few months, Colonel Chung and I have looked, when trying to schedule our Grand Round speakers, towards making a really deliberate point to look for great leaders around the country who can provide us with some insight and really give us some personal experiences to help us navigate the challenging times that we're all facing today as leaders. We're incredibly honored today to be joined by another subject matter expert on leadership, retired General Martin Dempsey. And I just want to provide you with a brief introduction. So General Dempsey served as the 18th chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is the highest ranking and most senior military officer of our U.S. Armed Forces, and also the top military advisor to the Secretary of Defense and the President. Prior to that, he also served as the U.S. Army Chief of Staff. He's a 1974 graduate of West Point, and he has master's degrees from both Duke, Army Command and General Staff College, and the National War College. He was previously named one of the 100 most influential leaders in the world by Time magazine, and most recently was also knighted by Queen Elizabeth II. He was written a couple incredibly noteworthy books on the topic of leadership, to include No Time for Spectators and Radical Inclusion. Since his retirement from the military, he's continued to teach on leadership and public policy at Duke University. He also serves as the special advisor to the commissioner of the NBA on leader development and youth programs, as well as serving as the chairman of USA Basketball. So General Dempsey, we're incredibly excited to have you here with us today and take some time out of your busy schedule to really engage with our internal medicine team. I'm going to open the floor to you for some initial remarks before we hand it over to Colonel Hartzel and his internal medicine residency team for some question and answers here.
All right, Jason, thanks very much. I'm glad this worked out. I've been looking forward to this. I'm not sure if I'm an expert on leadership, but I still, in a very sincere way, consider myself a student of leadership. And maybe in that spirit, the exchange we can have today will help both of us. I do want to mention before we begin, I want to thank you all of you on this Zoom session for doing what you do. Last Friday was the 10-year anniversary of my last cancer treatment. I had throat cancer and underwent 7 weeks of radiation and a few doses along the way of chemotherapy. And I rang the bell on October 30th of 2010. So it's pretty good, pretty cool that I get now to talk to you all with that anniversary in mind. And by the way, everything's going fine, thankfully. And also, thanks for what you're doing in this current crisis. I think we've got a little distance to travel with it, but we maybe want to talk about that along the way. So what I want to say by way of, kind of priming the pump maybe, is that when I retired from the military back in 2015, I wanted to figure out what just happened. I mean, honestly, it was one of those moments where, you run through the tape in whatever job you're doing, and then you get to the other side of the tape and you kind of think back on the race you've run. And one of the things that I really was captured by is how dramatically different, let's say, the last 10 years of my career were than the first 30 years of my career. And not just because I was wearing 4 stars. It was more about what I eventually chose to call the era of digital echoes. And what I meant by that, what I mean by it now, is that everything a leader does in this era now is everything moves faster, it's more complex, and leaders are subjected to intense scrutiny. And so I wanted to reflect on what it took to be a leader in that environment. And I came up with I came up with more than 3 attributes, but the 3 I would mention to you today, because you're still living in this era of digital echoes where, I mean, think of the analogy of somebody tossing a pebble in a pond and the concentric circles moving away. They move fast. You can't catch them. You can throw another pebble in to try to, replicate the first one, but it won't catch the first one because that first one is gone. And so one of the real attributes of leaders in this environment, I think, is we all have to do our best to be sense makers. We have to help the people that rely upon us to make sense of things. And that's certainly true today, when we see the kind of convergence of different crises, which I'll talk about in just a moment. So sense maker. The second thing is it gets harder to build a sense of belonging in your team because there's so many distractions. I mean, there've always been distractions, but now there's far more distractions because you have those who count on you have far more access to other distractions. And so you're kind of, think of it this way, you're in a competition with those who are entrusted to your care for their attention. So you have to really work hard to establish that sense of belonging. And then the third one, to counter this idea of inclusion, this idea of the digital echo, is I think you've got to work harder to make people feel like that their contributions matter. So, if you want later, we can talk about the difference between diversity and inclusion. But if you'll allow me at this point just to say, and for you to accept as an attribute, you got to have an instinct to make sure people feel like they belong and that their contributions matter. And therefore, there's a sense of inclusion to help counter the other distractions, the other aspects of their life that are cascading around them. Okay, that's the era of digital echo. But the other thing I wanted to mention up front was, in a way that I don't think people spend much time thinking about, and at least I haven't heard much discussed about it in this way, is that we're really in the middle of 3 converging crises, or maybe 3 concurrent crises. There's the pandemic, there's an economic crisis, which we haven't, depending on how, your particular state in life, it's either a real crisis for you, or it could be a long-term crisis that you have to deal with to make sure that your 401k doesn't evaporate before your eyes. But it's an economic change. I do think it's a crisis that it'll take quite a while to overcome. But in any case, it's a second crisis. And the third one, of course, is the resurgence of issues among us based on our race. And I use that, I phrase it that way because I'm probably one of the few people on this session who were alive in the 60s. And I can remember with some clarity the year 1968. And then I can remember with equal clarity that some of those issues did get resolved in the 60s and in 1968 in particular, but many of them didn't. And so, now they're coming due as I think maybe those back then anticipated they would, but they're here. And it's actually not a bad thing that they're here because they were deferred. My instinct is that the political system back in the 60s, I was too young to understand it fully, but that they found a way to do what they could and build consensus around it, but knew for sure that they hadn't solved all the problems. And sure enough, those problems, issues like social justice, are still with us. But the point is, that's the third of the concurrent crises. Now, you'll hear people talk about the 3 of them independently. You'll hear people wax about the pandemic and the likelihood of what it will do. And then you hear people talk about the economy, you hear people talk about race. The fact is they all produce the same thing. And this is the one thing we don't talk about enough. And it's fear. If you think about the pandemic, people are afraid of the pandemic. They're fearful that they'll become ill. They're fearful that their families will become ill. They're fearful that, their coworkers will become ill. And so that's one fear-producing crisis. The second was the economy. I can tell you from being an instructor, a professor of practice at Duke and a speaker at numerous graduations over the years, and including this year to high school graduates. And they're fearful about whether the career or the occupation or the profession that they aspire to follow, whether it'll still be available to them. And even more fundamentally, there's people who are just worried about their jobs and whether, especially in the service industry. And of course, the economic crisis doesn't touch everybody equally. So it then exacerbates the third issue, the issue of race, where people are fearful. It's really, it's just, I think we have to be honest with each other. There are people, notably men and women of color, who are fearful that nothing will change, that we'll just kick this down the road again, and then there'll be another incident that either exacerbates or rekindles the issues. So they're fearful that nothing will change. And then there's other people in this country who are fearful that things will change and that the advantages they enjoy will be lost to them. And so it's all about, how do leaders at every level, to include us, how do we help people navigate through their fear? Because that's what's actually making this such an uncomfortable period in our history. Not just that it's a pandemic that we don't fully understand, not just that the economy is struggling, not just that we have social issues that need to be solved, but it's the fear that they generate, and then the way that they build on each other because they're occurring at the same time. And there are some attributes, in my judgment, that are necessary for leaders to help us through our fears. One of them seems clear to me to be the ability to communicate, and to communicate in a way that acknowledges those fears, and even more than just acknowledges, is at least somewhat empathetic to them. I mean, I think we have to be, if we hope to be the leaders we can be, I think we have to acknowledge that even if we may not feel the fears that others are feeling, but if they're entrusted to our care, we ought to be somewhat empathetic to it and acknowledge it. So I think communications it's always important, but it gets extraordinarily important when you have crises. The second one is candor. We always want our leaders to be candid with us. We want what they are telling us to be based in, science or facts or something that's not just their own personal opinion. So they have to work, leaders have to work to be able to make sense. I told you about being a sense maker, and then to be candid with those entrusted to their care. The third one is consistent. In a crisis, one of the worst things you can do is contradict yourself in the way that you present information. Now, sometimes, things change, and in particular when you're dealing with things like the pandemic, where the facts or the science. I mean, science is that it's, this better than I do, but by its very nature, it's experimental, and so things are going to change. But there's a way to communicate the change consistently, so it doesn't feel like we're making these wild swings of advice to the people who are entrusted to us. And the last one is, I just believe that being a man or woman of character is a necessary attribute of a leader. It becomes even more so when you're dealing with crises, and we're in the middle of a crisis. And I think our collective reputation for having that, but that we're motivated by character, not by personal gain, is what will eventually carry us through. And by the way, let me tell you one last thing about character before I turn it over to Jason. I've often thought about this, what can you control in your life? And when you take out a piece of paper and you categorize and list the things in your life that you control, there's not many of them, actually. I mean, I just finished telling you I had cancer. I was on, TRADOC commander, 4-star general, not yet heir apparent, but soon to be the heir apparent, to be the chief of staff of the Army. And I got cancer, and I didn't go looking for it. Apparently, it came looking for me. But the point is, very quickly you realize how you can lose complete control in a situation like that. But then, if you're honest with yourself, there's just a lot that you can't control. But there's one thing that you absolutely control 100% of the time. And that's your character. You know, when faced with decisions and challenges, you know, that little voice in your head that says, this is right, this is wrong. And that thing, you know, that I call it a moral compass, we can control that 100% of the time. And so in a crisis, it becomes even more important to have it and to use it in making the decisions you need to make. With that, Jason, let me turn it back over to you.
Yeah. No, thanks, sir, for those introductory comments. And I think you really hit the nail on the head as far as, you know, the intertwining crises that we're all, you know, dealing with right now, the three big ones. And also, I liked your points about, you know, just trying to be as consistent as possible. And I think that's, in the medical field, that's what we've struggled with the most, is with the ever-changing science still projecting that consistent message that, you know, is resonating well with those below us. So yeah, I really appreciate those opening comments. I'm going to turn it over to Colonel Hartzel and his internal medicine team, who are going to ask you some questions now.
So, sir, great to see you. Really appreciate you joining us, and just want to say it looks like we're in for a master class on leadership development after that opening. So thank you for that. We have 70 internal medicine residents and over 600 trainees here at Walter Reed. And I think part of what we're trying to do is, you know, not only make them the best physicians they can be, but also make them the best military medical corps officers. So we definitely relish the opportunity to learn from you today. And we wanted to let the residents ask you firsthand some of the questions that they have about leadership development. So I'm going to turn it over to Captain Lisa Conte. She's one of our third-year internal medicine residents, and we'll have a couple other residents joining us this morning.
Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for talking with us. This is such a pleasure, and I really liked your introduction. You're kind of getting into some of our further questions, but if you don't mind, if we could just take a step back before we talk about the crises. Has being a leader always been a part of who you are and ingrained in you from an early age?
Yeah, I saw that question on the list, and it may be one of the most difficult because it gets at that whole nurture or nature issue. You know, is are leaders born, or are they nurtured along, by a series of people, from parents to mentors, to become who they are? I think it's probably mostly that they're nurtured to become leaders. They have the opportunity to do so. But I'm sure there are certain, look, I've got 9 grandchildren. 2 of them are twins, born a minute apart, and they're just so different. I love the difference actually in them. But it did cause me to, to think about how and they've been raised exactly the same way by literally raised exactly the same way by their parents. And they have such different interests. They have different abilities to communicate. They learn differently. It's just fascinating to me. So here's what I would say. I think most of what allows you to become a leader, and I chose that word carefully, that allows you to become a leader, is that leaders that come before you, to include parents and coaches and teachers and mentors, kind of unlock the doors so that you can be who you are. And then and if you have that opportunity to be who you are, then some of us become leaders and some of us don't. But I think it starts with opportunities presented at an early age, and expectations established at an early age. And then and by the way, when I say opportunities presented at an early age, look, you only get to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs if certain jobs open up when you happen to be eligible for them. You know what I mean? So, if I had think about this, if I had discovered my cancer a month later or 2 months later, then the opportunity to be the chief of staff of the Army would have passed me by, because I would have been undergoing treatment when that decision was being made. And if I didn't become the chief of staff of the Army, I couldn't have become the chairman. Now, I still would have retired rather happily as a 4-star general TRADOC commander. But, it's a lot of it is, here's what I say. You can't go looking for history. It's going to find you or it's not going to find you. But because you don't know who's going to find you or what's going to find you or if history is going to find you, you got to be ready. You got to be doing the best job you can in the job you have, not wishing for your next job and overlooking the one you're in. I mean, you might want to run Walter Reed Hospital, you might want to run the joint someday, but it won't happen unless you actually master the job you're in right now. And then along the way, you hope that people continue to mentor you. So that's a long circular answer to a very complex question. And I hope there's something in there that came close to answering it.
Oh, certainly. That was a perfect answer. A lot of pearls in there in terms of what to do next for us growing leaders. My next question for you is, you kind of touched on this in your introduction, but what is your advice to current leaders regarding how to effectively lead during the initial question said this unprecedented world crisis, but I want to rephrase based on what you said earlier, these crises or these multiple crises we have.
Yeah. Well, first of all, and I don't want to repeat myself, but I must in a couple of ways. The first thing is, although you may see yourself as relatively junior in the chain of command, you're still, for a lot of people out there, you're still, you still are the person to whom they will look to help them make sense of it all. And so, the way you become a sense maker is you have to make a personal commitment to be a lifelong learner yourself. I mean, you just can't be satisfied. If you're a leader, you can't be satisfied to read the cliff notes of the novel. Unfortunately, you're gonna have to read the novel to figure out, exactly how it all fits together. So leaders, to be sense makers, have to be committed to real, genuine learning and being, as Einstein put it, passionately curious. So that's number one, and always is. Second, I mentioned the word empathy. I just personally think empathy is a very important attribute at a time like this. And in a similar way, I think it's near synonym, in my judgment, as humility. You know what I mean? I think leaders need to be humble, mostly because if you're humble, people will consider you approachable. And if you're not humble, then, people are not going to come and tug on your sleeve and say, hey, could you help me figure this out? I mean, by the way, it's really fascinating to watch two groups of people and the way they're portrayed maybe three, and the way they're portrayed in the media: doctors, police officers, and military leaders. It's fascinating, So if you watch Blue Bloods, you're going to get one vision of what a police force can and should be. If you watch some other show, you're going to get another image of it. But people are really fascinated by that. They're fascinated by how many doctor shows are there, in the media. And some of the doctors are portrayed as humble and approachable and sincere and caring and empathetic, and others are portrayed exactly the opposite of that. And the same thing with military leaders. You got the chest thumping, George Patton figure who goes and, slaps a soldier who he thinks is shirking his responsibility. And then you've got, other portrayals of military leaders. Now, I mention that because those are Hollywood's impressions of us. But what I hope is our self-image is that we're humbled by the opportunity. I mean, there's a lot of people in the world a lot of young boys and girls in the world grow up saying, I want to be a doctor someday. Thank God they say that. And a lot of young boys and girls say, I want to grow up and be in the Army. And a lot of people say, I want to grow up and be a policeman or a fireman, somebody in the first responder thing. And I think it's wonderful that young boys and girls still want to be part of all of that. And you've got two of it combined. You got the medical profession and the military profession, both of them in your life, both with the attributes of being a profession. So I guess what I would say is, sense making, learning, empathy, humility, because the hard skill part of it is going to be, you're going to get that whether you want it or not. You're not going to pass your boards unless you got, you can do whatever you do. You're just not. But I don't know how anybody can measure. I mean, there's ways you can measure, someone's, commitment to learning, commitment to humility, commitment to empathy. But once you get through the board, that's one of the, that's probably the last time anybody's going to actually, open up the hood and check you out in that way. So I think you have to make the commitment, especially at times like this, to have those qualities.
Sir, so I'm just going to ask, first off, I appreciate you emphasizing the importance of the boards.
Yeah.
We definitely want them
Right
to
on
pass.
time, sir.
Oh, good. Yeah.
I wanted to follow up on the point about humility. We were kind of struck initially just talking to you before the show about your own humility. And I'm just curious, what does that look like if you're a junior leader and someone says, oh, you need to be more humble, or even a more senior leader and someone says, wow, I wish they were more humble. Yeah. What are some of the concrete steps or things that you can do to sort of be humble?
First and foremost, if you're a leader, and I can speak, I can speak about leaders I've encountered in corporate America, academia, professional sports, and the military. And if you're a leader and you are in awe of the responsibility, in other words, you realize that leadership is a privilege, not an entitlement, then you're on the right path. In other words, what I recall vividly, every time I got a new, I made another rank, and I did run the table on rank, but every time I got a new rank, I did what everybody does. You put on the uniform for the first time, and you see how do I look in those colonels, birds, and how do I look with those 2 stars on my shoulder? And then you got to get past that, because it ain't about how you look. Then the second thought I always had 100% of the time, especially when I became chairman, was, wow, I hope this isn't the one where I'm out in front of my headlights. I hope this is not the one where, I've now managed to exceed my capabilities. And then you get beyond that and you realize that, you have no choice. If someone has identified in you the potential to do that, then you have the obligation to fulfill the responsibilities, but always with an idea that, in my judgment, that there's 25, 30, 40, 100 people that could also do it. And so you say to yourself, well, I guess I better give this a try, because there's 25 other people who didn't get picked and I did, and or more. So, but the larger issue is humility is, it has to be kind of, you can't walk into a meeting and say, okay, I think one of the things I want you to see in me is humility. Okay, well, I'll look, but really it's got to come from you, not from us. And so, I just think it has to be a habit, you know what I mean? And then the second thing is, I'm a big fan of Aristotle and the Aristotelian mean, kind of everything in moderation, where you have courage and fear. I think they balance each other if you allow them to. And I think humility and ambition balance each other if you allow them to. So look, you don't get to be the chairman unless you're a little ambitious. In other words, unless you are confident enough to make sure you articulate the fact that, yeah, I think I can do that job. Now, it would be a little silly to say that when you're a captain, but by the time you get to be a 4-star, you probably ought to be able to do that job. And you probably have had the experiences necessary to do it. But if you are so eager and ambitious to have that job that it creates the impression in people that you've lost any sense of humility about how important that job is and how unimportant you are individually in a profession of 2 million men and women, then I think you've swung and missed. So, I just think it's a habit. In fact, all of character, all the attributes that create your character have to be habits, and you have to be conscious of the fact that, you know, you might fill your knowledge rucksack and you might fill your experience rucksack, but don't forget to fill your character rucksack by making tough decisions based on character.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, sir. Thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to Captain Kevin Pack, who's going to ask
sir.
next question.
Yeah, hi, sir. So I've been reading your book called No Time for Spectators. And in the first part of the book, there's a recurring motif. And the sentence that you write is, the people in your life know what's good for you more than you do.
Yeah.
And with that, who are the mentors in your life? And what was important to you initially as you were starting off your career?
Yeah, I did that. I wrote that that refrain, if you will, in that introductory chapter to kind of foreshadow what the rest of the book would be about. The idea that you will spend the vast majority of your personal and professional life as a follower, and episodically you'll be a leader. And so what I wanted up front, what I wanted to convey was that make sure that you recognize the people in your life who can in fact have make such a big impression on you, and celebrate that, and then try to be that person for others. You asked me about my own personal life. I mean, it starts out with my maternal grandmother, who at 16 came from Ireland, married at age to the United States, settled in Bayonne, New Jersey, married at 23. Her husband died at 44. And so she raised the family, all the things that you'd expect to have happen in a tragedy like that. And when I was born, I was the firstborn grandchild, and she was bound and determined to make sure I knew that I had some Irish ethnicity in me. She actually, the way I tell people is, she made sure that I knew I was Irish first, Catholic second, and an American third. But she did it in a way that, allowed me to appreciate the way those three things should fit together in this country, or at least in our family. And so she had an enormous impact, and she helped build my confidence in ways that I'm sure continue to affect me even when I became a four-star general. And then my own mother, who was, if you've read the book, I had no intention of going to West Point.
Right.
And she fundamentally, I went to West Point for her. And then it turns out that it turned out to be a pretty good decision. And so, again, it doesn't mean your parents or your grandparents are always right. But like, the Mark Twain famously said, man, when I was 18, my father didn't know anything. And then all of a sudden I turned 22 and I found him to be really smart. What happened? How did my father get so smart in the intervening 4 years? So I think that was one of the things that I wanted to do. Now, the second thing, in the military, I think most military members in the audience would agree with this. Most of us stay in the military because their first platoon sergeant, or their first sergeant, or their first platoon leader, or their first company commander lights their fire. It's as simple as that. I remember when I was chief, all the studies and analysis and decisions we would make about how to improve retention. And I always took the briefings, and I always did what I could at that level to help retention. But I was always well aware that the person who has control over retention in our military is the first line leader of that brand new private. That's just the way it is, In fact, there's an old cliche that young men and women will remember their their drill sergeant more than they'll ever remember anyone else in their military career. That drill sergeant, that platoon leader, that troop commander and first sergeant, or company commander and first sergeant, have a lot more to say about how we retain the force than any four-star general does. And I did. I had some great leaders when I was a lieutenant. I had some later that weren't so great, but I had a foundation. I kind of knew what right looked like. And so I held on to it, even in the times when I was learning what I didn't want to be from some other leaders along the way. And then here's the last thing I'll say about that, about mentoring and influences. The interesting thing about becoming a 4-star is that it's, your mentors, if you always thought about mentors as someone senior to you, you kind of run out at that point. And as the chairman, I especially ran out because I was the senior military officer in the armed forces. But what I had learned as a general, all the way back to when I became a 1-star, is that most of my mentors from 1-star to 4-star were actually junior to me. I would look for someone who I could trust to be candid with me, to give me advice, to be, believe it or not, to be listeners, and to tell me when I wasn't listening as much as I should. So, by the time I got to be the chairman, my mentors were and this is how I selected them when I had to choose an aide de camp, or I had to choose someone to be an executive officer, or someone to be in my initiatives group. I would always, in the interview, I would try to figure out, is this somebody who's going to tell me what I want to hear all the time, which is a real danger if you become senior, or are they going to be able to converse with me with confidence about really tough issues to help me think out loud and come to some decisions. So I would say to you, the more senior you get, the more you ought to look to see who can be mentors among your peers and even those junior to you.
Thank you, sir. So my second question I had, sir, was can you provide some examples from your past roles, past leadership positions where you were presented with a unique challenge and how you approached it, and were you successful or not?
Yeah, if you're a baseball player, you're probably getting in the Hall of Fame if you get it right a third of the time, right? That's probably also true as a company grade officer. If you can kind of maneuver your way to get it right about a third of the time, you're probably going to be okay. And then you get to be kind of mid-career, lieutenant colonel, colonel. I think expectations are a little higher. And then, maybe there you got to break 50%. And then you get up to be the, chief staff of the Army or the chairman, you can't bat 300 and you can't bat 500. And the reason is that all the easy issues are stripped away long before they get to you. In fact, if anyone ever brought me a, kind of a softball issue as chief or chairman, I'd say, what are you bringing this to me for? Surely there's somebody, junior to me that can solve that problem. And eventually we calibrated, what it was that I had to deal with. And then, you just, you make decisions. I tell people often ask me, how do presidents make decisions? And I use the example of an eye doctor, actually. And, that crazy looking plastic kidney shaped thing they put on your face. And then they start flipping lenses, is this clear or is that clear? 1 or 2, A or B. And, eventually you give up and say, just give me the glasses, please. You're killing me. So, but that's actually a pretty decent metaphor for how really senior leaders, maybe not just really senior leaders, but you'll get all the information you can possibly accumulate. In the case of a president, it's, foreign policy implications, national security implications, domestic implications, budget implications. And then you go back to your office, if you're the president, the Oval Office, and, you might have 2 or 3 really trusted advisors with you. And you make the decision after talking to them. And at some point you allow your character, here it is again, to be the touchstone against which you bring all the information available, and then based on what's in here, you make the decision. And so there's so many examples, really. And by the way, then you take responsibility. If you're going to make the decision, own it. And then if it goes well, you share the accomplishment. And if it goes badly, you take responsibility. You know, you share credit and take blame. And there's plenty of examples in my life where, you know, I did everything I just told you, made a decision, and you know, sometimes it went really well, sometimes it didn't go so well. And it could be anything from a maintenance decision or a decision in a tactical scenario, or, you know, a decision in combat, or a decision in, you know, where you lose soldiers that probably you shouldn't have lost, you know, if it had gone a different way, recognizing that the enemy is always going to have something to say about that. And then of course in Washington, D.C., you make a decision, but there's a lot of stakeholders in Washington, D.C. There's, you know, there's if I'm a military leader making the decision, there's the Department of Defense. There's the Congress of the United States, there, you know, which owns all of the budgetary responsibility that might be necessary to make the decision go. And then there's the, you know, the executive branch where, you know, they actually do have the authority to make military decisions about the use of force. So, you know, I can't actually pin one down for you now, but I can promise you that there have been times when I felt very good about the decision and how it went. And there were times when I didn't feel like, you know, maybe I felt like a swing and a miss. Like I said, you got to own both of them.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
I think we're going to switch out the question askers, but I want to follow up on that because I think it's, you know, one of the things we talk about is failing or not being successful. And you sort of just mentioned this, but I'm just curious, what advice do you have for junior leaders or even, you know, more senior leaders about how to approach failure when it does occur, either for you personally or for your organization?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and especially for you all, you know, when, you know, you either are already or are soon to be making life and death decisions about, you know, and even, you know, ethical decisions, right? About medicine and prolonging life and all the things that, you know, that come across your desk or your bedside on a daily basis. Well, you know, the cliche answer is we learn more from our failures than we do from our successes. And I actually do believe that, you know, in those cases where in a training exercise or in combat or you know, in the situation room where things didn't go my way, I was, you know, I'm a big believer in being introspective and reflective about failure. And that, in fact, is part of our Army culture, AARs, not just Army. I see we have other services, of course, but, you know, I remember being on an aircraft carrier for the first time, and they took me out to the pit to watch carrier landings. And I'm standing there with a bunch of junior grade officers who were, you know, literally with a clipboard, the peers of that pilot grading every single landing, every takeoff and landing, and then going back to the, you know, to the debriefing room and, you know, showing the video and taking that pilot through the steps. And, you know, why'd you hit the third arresting cable instead of the second arresting cable? And it was fascinating to me. I think it's the real strength of our military, by the way, that we can be critical of each other in a constructive way without, you know, without creating antibodies. And maybe that's the best answer to your question is you can't, if you fail at something, you have to own it. I don't think you have to, you know, carry it around like the rock of Sisyphus for the rest of your life, but I think you have to carry it long enough to learn from it. And then you got to let it go. If you're still in the job, you know, if the mistake is so serious, you know, maybe you're not there anymore. But if you are, you got to let it go. And now you've got more knowledge and experience than you did before. Your character is probably strengthened by that, but you got to let it go and get on with it. But you can't let it go too soon, and you can't carry it too long. And it's your own personal judgment on what that means.
Great, thank you, sir. I'm going to turn it over to Lieutenant AJ Greco, who's going to ask you a couple other questions.
Sir, thank you again
Hello,
for talking.
AJ. No, my pleasure.
So one of the questions I have is, as internal medicine residents, we're medical providers. We sometimes see things in the system that we think should change, but we're not really in leadership positions. You mentioned in your book about being responsibly rebellious. What
Yeah.
advice do you have for junior officers about really executing that idea?
Yeah. Well, my advice is, so first of all, there are certain leaders, and this is in any walk of life, who approach leadership in a way that will allow a culture of responsible rebelliousness, and who articulate both in word and deed and gesture and body language that disagreement isn't disloyalty until the decision is made. Once a decision is made, I got it. Either you can live with the decision or you can't. If you can't, you go. I mean, you just have to say, I got to do something else. But that's really rare, actually, thankfully. But up to the point where the decision is made, I do think leaders should be willing to accept some disagreement. To your question about junior officers, they're kind of the recipient of the culture that is created by those who have more rank than they do. And I'll just tell you this, I've had those junior to me, I've had some who approached me in a way that allowed me to accept what they were saying without becoming defensive about it. And I've had some, again, I could name names, but it wouldn't do you or me or them any good, who approached me in a way that kind of turned me off about it, even though my instinct is always to be inclusive. And, I work at it actually. But I had a brigade commander in Iraq working for me. I was the 2-star general. I'll give you 2 examples. I had 2 brigade commanders. I had 6, but I had 2 brigade commanders who I would juxtapose for you. One, I would go visit them. They would tell me what was going on. They would take me out to interact with junior leaders. They would, and then at some point in the conversation, they would say, "Hey, sir, there's a couple of things you could actually do for us at your level that would be helpful to us." Okay, that was one. And I would say, "Oh my God, yeah, I want to be as helpful as I can," right? The other one, I would go to visit, we go into a briefing room. The most senior guy, the briefer, the brigade commander felt like he was the only one that could possibly talk to the 2-star general. So everybody else was shut down and sitting around the corner, bored out of their minds. And the briefing was less about what they were doing and more about what I should be doing. And it just, as hard as I tried, it just, is it appropriate on Zoom to say pissed me off? Because it really pissed me off, because I was there to find out, I was literally there to find out what I could do for them. But I didn't want it to be stuck in my ear and broken off like a number 2 pencil. I wanted to have a conversation about the operating environment, the challenges, the things we needed to continue as best practices, about how the individual soldiers were doing and their families at home. And instead, I got a colonel I'm a 2-star general. Not that I was very prideful, but I got a colonel who's going to tell me how to do my job without saying a word about how he was doing his job. So you can imagine I didn't do, I didn't take away much from that visit. So to your point, I think that there's always a way to get your point across that makes it more likely to be received in the spirit in which it's intended. But I had to learn that in talking to the President of the United States. Busy guy. The other thing you have to be cognizant of is what's going on in their life. So when I would go brief the president, I knew that if I picked the wrong time, he's busy, maybe he's mad about something, not me, but at me, but. And I go stumbling in and say, "Hey, sir, how about 5,000 more soldiers or Marines in Afghanistan?" "Oh, yeah, that's good. That's great. Good timing, General." There you go. Out the door, no answer or the wrong answer. But if I made sure I was aware of what was going on in his life, I could figure out where I could seize the opportunity to get a tough question resolved. And I also reached out for people who could help me. So I became, very collegial, let's call it, with the chief of staff of the White House. And if I had something really contentious with President Obama, I'd call his name was Dennis McDonough, and I'd say, hey, Chief, I got a hot one here, and it's contentious. Can you help me, help me figure out when's the best time to introduce it to the president? And he was extraordinarily helpful in doing that. So I think to answer your question, responsible rebelliousness is always a lot more likely to be accepted if the spirit of it is that you're trying to make the whole better, the outcome better, than if you're trying to be self-aggrandizing. And my brigade commander was mostly doing what he was doing because he wanted me to see him as the best brigade commander. And in fact, it had the opposite effect on me. So, it's about your motivation for being a little rebellious, and it's about choosing your moments, not just blindly stumbling into them, because that normally doesn't have a happy ending.
Perfect. Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
That definitely makes a lot of sense. But
I think, I want to make sure that you carry away from this, though, that those of us in leadership positions need our junior leaders to be vocal with us, to see what's really going on. And even if it's going to make us mad, you still got to have the courage to do it if it's something really important. And then if you're listening to this and you're in a leadership position, you just got to be a better listener. I don't know that I've ever met anybody where I said, you can't get any better at listening. We can all get better at listening.
Yeah, I think the other thing I heard there was the part about presentation and how you approach those senior leaders. Because I think over time I've seen very similar, like people who are just burning bridges, thinking that they're going to get something done versus sort of taking a more nuanced approach, which tends to work a little bit better.
Yeah. Yep, for sure.
So the other question I had for you is, someone who's worked with medical officers at all levels, as high as you can go, what do you think makes an effective medical corps officer as a staff officer?
Well, I think, first of all, in terms of being an officer in general, there's a really good book. It's a work of fiction, historical fiction, called Once an Eagle. It's a little Army centric, so I'm reluctant to bring it up to you, but it's about two different leaders in World War II. Again, it's fictional, and one rises to the top, 4 stars, but he's a West Pointer, and he climbs over everybody's back, and doesn't care who he discards along the way. And then the other one rises up through the ranks, much just humble and really works at being competent. And at the end of his career, his aide de camp is a captain and says to him, hey, General, how do I get to be a leader like you? He wasn't saying, how do I get to be a 4-star? That's the wrong question. How do I get to be a leader like you? And this guy's name is Sam Damon. And Sam Damon, the general, responds and says, well, look, let me put it this way. If you ever have to choose between being a good officer and a good person, be a good person. And I would say that's the start to the answer to your question. Just be a good person. And, generally speaking, whatever field you find yourself in, you'll be approachable. You'll be someone whose opinion is valued. You'll be, a valuable member of the team. And then, I think besides that, the second thing I would say is that to be the best medical corps officer in my sphere. So when I had a division surgeon as a 2-star division commander, or when I had a joint staff surgeon, Nadja West, when I was the chairman, I think what you have to do is sometimes you have to make yourself visible to the. So, in other words, it wasn't that my surgeon was out of sight, out of mind. It was normally that the only time I saw them is if we had a real problem on our hands, like in Baghdad, the division surgeon comes in and says, "Hey, sir, we got a rash of food poisoning, or we're beginning to suffer excessive heat casualties," and the best, I was blessed with great medical advice at every level at which I commanded, because they would always come to me and with the problem, but never just kind of toss it on my desk and turn on their heel and walk out. They'd say, and here's what I think we should do about it. And then we would kind of negotiate what we were going to do, because it was, you know, they didn't understand what I was trying to deal with, and I didn't understand what they were trying to deal with. And so we figured out what we could get done in the constraints of each of our responsibilities. So I think you don't want to be a wallflower in meetings. You have to have something to say, but you also don't want to try to compete with the operations officer for time, because if I'm in a meeting and I'm hearing more from my division surgeon than from my operations officer, we got a problem, because I'm supposed to be winning this fight over here. I'm supposed to stay healthy too, but I'm supposed to be winning this fight over here. So you have to understand, again, you have to understand the person who you are advising. You owe them with absolute integrity, your best judgments and advice, and you owe them solutions to the problems you identify, not just identifying the problems. And what they owe you is the time to hear you out. And sometimes you got to elbow your way past the chief of staff, or you got to elbow your way past the operations officer. Or if they, oftentimes I never did it, but oftentimes some commanders will put the medical officer under some other staff officer. So, you could get buried under the personnel officer. You could get buried under the civil affairs officer. I don't know. But I always made sure that the medical advisor to me was directly to me, not through somebody else. I mean, everybody has to respond to the chief of staff or to the XO on a ship. But the point is, I wasn't buried in the staff. I didn't want him or her buried in the staff someplace. So you have to negotiate all that.
So, sir, I think we probably have time for one more question. Okay. I would say maybe a short answer. I'm not sure if that's possible with the question, but I'm going to let AJ ask just one last question to kind of wrap up.
That was very subtle of you telling me to keep it short. I appreciate that.
Sir, in your recent book, you talked about living a felt life. Can you give more description on what you meant by that? Maybe some examples?
Well, first of all, it's a lifelong effort to figure that out. I mean, honestly, the first time I heard it, I was fascinated by it. Initially, I kind of shrugged it off as, some old crusty English professor, being, somehow esoteric with me. And, but then I realized if we're not careful, we really can create our lives to be kind of mechanical. You can fall into patterns. You can wish away one job in order to get to another. You can blow by people your people. You can blow by them in the heat of the moment, or with the excuse of being too busy to actually take the time. And so I always just felt that phrase was my way of reminding myself that as I continued to be blessed with leadership responsibilities, it was actually the people I was leading. I had a mission, and I knew I had to get the mission done. But for God's sakes, how can you neglect the people who are actually going to be the ones getting the mission done? And so I wanted to be mindful and aware that, as we did together try to work towards certain outcomes, that I had to take the time to literally feel what was going on around me. Because if you don't, your time it'll just get away from you. And I wanted people to know that they mattered. One little vignette, you're the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, briefers coming in the office constantly, the executive officer in the outer office scaring the bejesus out of them. You got 5 minutes. If you're not out here in 5 minutes, I'm coming in after you. I knew he was doing that. And so some poor lieutenant colonel coming into my office, never seen the chairman. The chairman is like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, and probably it's the only time in a 3-year tour where that young man or woman is ever going to see the chairman that close. This is before social distancing. And so in they come, you can tell they're just unsettled. They sit down with their PowerPoint briefing and they launch into it. And I'd say, nope, stop. And they'd say, what's the matter, sir? I said, I just don't want to do that right now. What don't you want to do, sir? I don't want to talk about the PowerPoint right now, so I don't have to. And they said, what do you want to talk about, sir? And I said, I want to talk about you. Who are you? What do you, where are you from? You have kids? How's your commute, for God's sakes? Everybody talks about their commute in Washington. So I wanted to let them know that it wasn't just the information they were bringing that was of value to me. It was them bringing it to me that was of value. It was a little thing, but it really allowed me to cement a reputation for caring about people. And the higher the more senior you become, the harder it is to keep that reputation. One of the ways to do it is make sure you lead a felt life, not just go through the mechanics.
Wow. So I think that's such a fitting way to sort of wrap this up, talking about how, caring for others and leading by caring. It's really been a pleasure to share this time with you. I think our residents are really grateful. A lot of wisdom I think we've learned, and I'm sure many of us will be going back to watch this again. And I'm going to turn it over to Colonel Chung. So thank you, sir.
Thank you.
General Dempsey, we're just incredibly grateful for you taking time out to share words of wisdom about us being good officers and just decent human beings. On behalf of our university president, Dr. Tom Thomas, I'd like to present you with this coin, university coin.
All right.
On the back, it says, learning to care for those in harm's way.
That's great. Okay, do me a favor. Since
Sure.
you can't hand it to me through the screen, and because I've got a collection of coins that would probably exceed most people's weight allowance in your next PCS move, I want you to take that coin and I want you to find someone junior deserving of it and give it to them on my behalf. Can you do that?
Yes, sir. Definitely can.
Okay. All right.
Sir, I have another coin to add to your collection that I can also do the same. But we have a Walter Reed Hospital coin, courtesy of Colonel Barr, our director of our hospital. On the front, it says, where the nation heals its heroes. And on the back is all of the services that are represented at our joint facility. And I want to really thank you for your time today. A lot of very insightful comments that you made. And in particular, I liked how you talked about making those key attributes habitual. And also about the importance of moral compass, and your character is the one thing that you can definitely impact, and that you alone really have the ability to affect each day. So those words really resonated with me, and I appreciate that as well.
Well, I've enjoyed our time together, and I will from time to time come up and walk through the halls of Walter Reed, or whatever it's called now, National Military Medical Center, and get hopelessly lost. And people are very kind to help me figure out which building is which and which hallway connects to it. So if we're ever up there together and you see me in the hall, or I see you, although I'm never going to figure out that other guy because he had his mask on, but I will. I'd be happy if you would stop me and remind me that we had these moments together, and I hope they've been helpful.
Thank you very much, sir. And thank you, Walter Reed and USU teams for joining us today. Signing off now.
Thanks.